All right. So yeah, I guess let's get started. So the way we'll do this, Aman, is they'll debate. Johnson and Andrew are a team, and Joseph and Rena are a team, and they're really the first sort of varsity squads that have come up for us. So we've got a few varsity teams now, but they were the first to make the foray. And then Johnson and Andrew just qualified for the gold division of the TOC, which is like the top 120 teams in the U.S. So they've gotten multiple bids for that tournament this year. And then Joseph and Rena have qualified as well, picking up 2 gold bids. So yeah, got some impressive debaters today to assess.
Great. Time will begin on my first word then. We affirm our first contention is the planet of prisons. America has an incarceration problem. The ACLU contextualizes, despite making up close to 5% of the global population, the US has more than 20% of the world's prison population. The issue is getting worse. The ACLU quantifies, since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 500%. 2 million people in jail and prison today, far outpacing population growth and crime. Fortunately, the solution is legalization. The Drug Policy Alliance explains over 1.6 million people are arrested each year in a drug law violation. Legalizing drugs means that the police can no longer arrest people for drug crimes. Kazniki Cato in 2016 explains full drug legalization would likely have positive direct effects on both the incarceration rate and the crime rate. Thus, having drug admissions would cut the prison population by nearly 10%. As a result, the Drug Policy Alliance finds empirically incarceration for drug-related offenses has plummeted in Portugal after decriminalization. The impact is a cycle of poverty. Incarceration leads to recidivism. Stefanski in 2019 writes, prison offers a network of career criminals that could further individuals' criminal prowess. Thus, ELPR of the Department of Justice quantifies 83% of state prisoners released in 2005 across 30 states were arrested at least once during the 9 years following the release. Because of the cycle, people continue to do crime instead of finding legal jobs. The Center for Community Change finds, if not for the rise in incarceration, the number of people in poverty will fall by as much as 20%. Contention 2 is ending America's longest war. The NCDAS reports 53 million, or 19.4% of people 12 and over, have used illegal drugs or misused prescription drugs within the last year. The NIDA quantifies this as up from 8.3% in 2002. Kilmer Rand contextualizes from 2006-2016, the total amount of money spent by Americans on cannabis, heroin, cocaine, and meth fluctuated between $120 billion and $145 billion each year. Fortunately, legalizing drugs would decrease drug deaths in 3 ways. First is safer regulation. Lopez-Vox in 2016 explains, legalizing and regulating drugs can make for safer drug use. If people get their drugs from a regulated source, governments can ensure that there's nothing that would make an already dangerous substance even more dangerous. Brown of CBC thus quantifies empirically after decriminalization in Portugal, the number of addicts was halved and overdose deaths had dropped to just 30 a year. But second is a shift from worse alternatives. Legalizing drugs would encourage people to shift from dangerous opioids to safer options like marijuana. Raymond in 2017 explains 80% of patients reported that cannabis by itself was more effective than their opioids. Thus, Normal in 2021 writes, cannabis access is associated with reduced rates of opioid use and abuse. Critically, Lopez furthers tobacco, alcohol, and opioids kill hundreds of thousands annually. Marijuana, meanwhile, has caused 0 overdose deaths. The AAC thus quantifies there was about a 25% lower rate of prescription painkiller overdose deaths on average after the implementation of a medical marijuana law that legalized marijuana. Third is encouraging rehabilitation. Zwick in 2020 finds the stigma surrounding individuals who have substance use disorders is a pervasive phenomenon that has had detrimental effects on treatment outcomes. Thus, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services explains in 2016, although 20.8 million people met the diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder in 2015, only 2.2 million individuals received any type of treatment. Fortunately, legalization destigmatizes drugs because crime is seen as inherently bad. Wire in 2018 concludes, once you start removing the stigma and people know it's okay to go to their counselor, they can go to their drug treatment sessions. Fract of the New York Times thus quantifies in 2020, after decriminalization, the number of people in Portugal receiving drug addiction treatment rose. As of 2008, 3/4 of those with opioid use disorder were receiving medication-assisted treatment. The impact is decreasing overdose deaths. The CDC quantifies nearly 841,000 people have died since 1999 from a drug overdose. Ultimately, Bruce in 2021 explains legalizing drugs like heroin and fentanyl will immediately save lives. Thus, we affirm.
Okay, in this case, time will begin my first word. We negate. Observe that in the status quo, drug enforcement is improving, as Quran 21 of the Guardian writes. Thanks to support by voters in Biden, drug policy in the United States is shifting away from punishment to things like decriminalization, focusing on treating addiction, and lighter punishments for drug possession without creating a legal industry. Lopez 18 confirms a spillover effect is occurring, where states adopting treatment and decriminalization are influencing voters and politicians in neighboring regions. Elkins of Cato confirms a majority of Americans support decriminalization, and overall, Fernando 21 finds adolescent drug use has decreased 25% in 2021, following a broader trend of decline. Usage will continue decreasing into the future as these teens eventually become adults. Thus, contention one is price drops. Legalization plummets prices for two reasons, and first is competition. DuPont 21 explains, legalization creates a commercial market for highly addictive substances, expanding the number of sellers. This causes mass competition in the industry and thus cheaper prices, increasing usage. Empirics prove, as Humphrey 17 writes, after the legalization of marijuana in multiple states, the price dropped by as much as 60%. Second is through transport. Calkins 12 explains currently the cost of smuggling drugs keep the price high, as it is not only difficult to move drugs around, but there's a risk of interception. With legalization, however, Calkins explains producers will be able to use legal methods of transport and mechanize the production and transport of drugs, dropping prices by as much as 95%. There are two impacts, and first is exports. Murray 19 explains criminals will no longer have to fear government crackdowns under legalization, allowing them to freely grow, buy, and sell their drugs internationally for cheaper from the U.S. Martin 20 confirms U.S. legalization will allow cartels to buy low in the U.S. and sell high across Africa. Unfortunately, Apollo 12 concludes drug traffickers in countries like Somalia fuel civil conflict and cause state collapse, which could affect millions. Second is usage. Lead 12 contextualizes, even when legalizing hard drugs like cocaine that take up the majority of disposable income, even small decreases in price have a huge effect on demand. Every 10% decrease in price increases usage by 13%. But contention two is Big Pharma. Keeping drugs illegal prevents corporations from accessing them, but pharmaceutical companies hijack legalization in three ways. The first is regulatory capture. O'Connell 21 writes, currently, regulators are lobbied by Big Pharma, spending hundreds of millions to delay regulation of their products. Lopez 18 confirms, every year, limits on production get looser and looser, while more generic copies are approved. Regulators themselves have admitted they're influenced. McGreal 17 confirms 90% of the House and 97 senators have all taken campaign contributions from pharmaceutical corporations to influence how medicines are approved and regulated. Legalization would thus be disastrous, as Lopez concludes, similar to how the opioid crisis was caused by a government failure to regulate production and usage. Legalization unleashes industrial production and consumption on a similar scale to the tobacco, alcohol, and opioid epidemics that kill hundreds of thousands every year. Second is overprescription. Lopez 18 explains, due to pharmaceutical insiders and drug regulators, companies have gotten away with lobbying and even bribing doctors to prescribe dangerous painkillers for simple aches. Legalization would also be entirely unregulated, allowing pharmaceutical companies to push doctors to prescribe substances like cocaine and heroin to patients. Fresks 19 confirms, after receiving benefits from pharmaceutical companies, doctors increased their prescriptions by 60%, and the NIDA corroborates 80% of heroin users were initially prescribed painkillers by their doctor, meaning most addicts began through prescriptions. The third is ads. New York Times 21 explains, once illicit drugs are legalized federally, pharmaceutical producers are protected by the First Amendment, enabling them to market freely. Current restrictions on cannabis ads are only constitutional since it is illegal federally. Thus, Stark of ABC concludes, ads downplay side effects. Thus, 80% of people remember the benefits, but only 20% remember the side effects. And Pew Trust finalizes drug sales increased by 43% after advertising to consumers. For all these reasons, Lopez 15 concludes legalization could triple hard drug usage, which Collins 14 equates to about 4.5 million more cases of drug dependency. The University of Pennsylvania quantifies drug use already costs the U.S. economy up to 10% of its GDP every year, and Daily 19 explains this is because substance use increases the chance of medical problems, housing instability, unemployment, and more. Degenhardt 04 confirms that drug users are 13 times more likely to die than their peers. And sadly, treatment fails too, as Correa 21 quantifies 45% of Americans are also unable to afford insured access to treatment care. And Greenspoon 21 finds the poorest and people of color are often least likely to get care 90% of the time and very likely to overdose and relapse. That's why Lopez concludes legal drugs kill many times more people than illegal drugs every single year. Thus we negate.
Ready for cross?
Yeah.
Can I have the first question since I spoke first?
For sure.
All right, I'll start time my first word. So let's talk about your first argument, specifically transport. Can cartels access legal forms of transport?
We would say once you legalize drugs, then like drug enforcement agencies are no longer cracking down on like criminals. And because of that, they're able to basically find legal loopholes and produce in the US legally. They're able to buy legally, and they can smuggle it to places where drugs are still illegal and then sell it for a way higher price and make a huge margin.
Okay, the problem with that though is that that's just not true, right? Crime is still a crime. Like there's still like, as long as they don't have regulations, or if they don't have like any like permits to sell drugs, then it's still illegal for them to transport
Very
these.
easy to get a
Cartels
permit.
don't have legal permits. No one's going to give a legal permit to a cartel. Therefore, cartels can't access legal forms of transportation.
If I can answer, I think you're underestimating how like international crime groups operate. They have so many subsidiaries, so many like puppets they can go through in order to get a permit. And even then in California, empirically, 90% of the market is illegal. And there are many cartels that are growing marijuana in there because the government has legalized drugs and they like don't care anymore. Can I have a question?
That's because like black markets have been around the entire time. But yeah, you can have a question.
Okay, let's talk about incarceration. Why are people of color disproportionately arrested for drugs?
I'd say that because there's systemic racism.
Okay, and why does systemic racism go away when you legalize drugs?
We don't make the argument that it's going to go away. We say that we're going to prevent police from accessing another avenue for them to enforce systemic racism by taking away the ability for them to arrest people disproportionately based on their race, just specifically because of like drug issues or drug crimes. Can I have a question?
Insofar as you're taking one avenue away out of hundreds of ways in which police can enforce like racially biased laws on people of color, what's to say that they're just like gonna turn to another way for arresting like people of color? Like there's so many other ways in which they can do it for things like traffic tickets, for things like I don't know, like bail violations, all of these other means of like conducting the same racist policing. Why does that go away?
Couple of responses here. Firstly, it's because drug policing is specifically the most important thing that impacts like racial minorities. That's what impacts them the most. But secondly, even if we don't solve for like systemic racism, I'd still say that like mitigating it mainly or like severely like decreasing it is still better than nothing, right? Just because we can't fix the entire problem doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to make it better. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, let us talk about overprescription. You say that when legalization happens, there's going to be no regulations. Why is that?
Because empirically, as we've seen with the opioid crisis, as we have seen with alcohol companies, as we have seen with tobacco companies, every time the US government tries to regulate dangerous substances, these companies like give them campaign contributions, give them fancy dinners, give all these sorts of benefits to politicians. And these politicians and regulators end up doing absolutely nothing.
But those things happen in the past, right? If you look at the most recent examples, as with weed, for example, they have
the most recent example is opioids.
Most recent examples is weed, like marijuana legalization, but that's cross.
And marijuana is still pretty dangerous.
I'll take a little bit of prep. All right, that was 5 seconds. Can everyone hear me all right? So it's just going to be down their case, starting with the overview that they read at the top. Is everyone ready? Let's start the time now. The first thing they get up and say is that there is decriminalization happening in the status quo. There are two issues with this overview. The first of which is that actions speak a lot louder than words. And what Schwartz explains in 2021 is that despite the fact that Biden has been giving some flowery rhetoric, Biden has actually passed a lot of policies to make it a lot easier to go after small criminals for things like petty drug use, which is that obviously decriminalization is not getting better in the status quo. But secondly, their evidence is only talking about decriminalization of marijuana. And while we agree that the decriminalization of marijuana is probably a pretty popular policy nationwide, there are a lot of other drugs, like for example, cocaine and fentanyl, for example, that are not popular in terms of decriminalization right now, which means that we still have uniqueness on our arguments. Let's go to their first contention, where they talk about price drops. The first big problem with this argument is that they tell you that there's going to be decreases in prices in our world, but this is already happening in the status quo, because what Bronstein explains in 2016 is that the prices of illicit drugs have fallen by 75% in the past few years, which is that all of their impacts are already materializing right now. There's absolutely no reason why their arguments are unique. But then they give you two reasons why prices are going to go down in our world. The first is about competition. There are a couple of issues here. The first is that we would argue that illicit drugs are inelastic because people who are addicted to drugs are going to buy these drugs anyways, which means that even if there's an increase in competition, it doesn't matter, because these companies know that no matter how high they charge their prices, people are going to buy their drugs anyway, so they don't have an incentive to decrease their prices. But the second big problem with this argument is that we would say that the legal firms that would be selling drugs in an affirmative world would be like companies like big monopolies, like big pharmaceutical companies, like they themselves tell you. So there's no competition because these companies are already so entrenched. They have a lot of market share. There's no competition with them. The second reason that they give is that there's going to be a decrease in transportation fees. And the issue here comes from Knives in 2021, who explains that because there's a heavy taxation on the legal industry, legal cannabis is oftentimes 2 or 3 times more expensive than the illegal cannabis. And this is really important because empirically in California, for example, what the Guardian explains is that 90% of the black market in of the marijuana market in California is still illegal, which is that empirically their argument just isn't true. Let's go to their first impact about exports. They say that's going to be easier for US cartels to sell in the developing world. This isn't true because we would argue that in the developing world, these countries already have their own established cartels, which is why they're not getting like drugs from US cartels. They have domestic cartels that they would probably buy from. Their second impact here talks about usage, but you can cross-apply my response earlier that drug use is often inelastic because these people are already addicted, which is that usage doesn't go up even if there's a decrease in price. Let's go to their second argument here, where they talk about big pharmaceutical companies. The first thing that they say is that there's going to be an increase in lobbying. There are 2 issues here. The first of which is that we would argue if anything, lobbying goes down in our world. The reason why is because what 1117 explains is that when there is legalization, there is legal industry, and that results in undermining these cartels. There's like legal industries that would undermine like the market share of big pharmaceutical companies, and as a result, they have less money to lobby. But secondly, what Ahmed explains in 2021 is that lobbying doesn't really matter because the Democrats aren't really budging. That's why, for example, they haven't passed that's why, for example, lobbying isn't working in the status quo. The second thing that they say is that there's overprescription, but the issue here is that overprescription is being solved right now because there are government lawsuits. So like Puro 2 explains that the federal government has been cracking down on fraud charges on these overprescription cases, which is why the AMA quantifies that overprescription has fallen by 44% in recent years. On their last argument here, where they talk about marketing, the first big problem with this argument is that marketing would be illegal in either world. What Davis 15 explains is that Section 843 of the Controlled Substances Act makes marketing of drugs a felony, which means that at the end of the day, this isn't going to change in either world. We would argue that marketing is going to be illegal either way. But secondly, what the Forbes evidence indicates is that marketing doesn't actually affect usage because the people who are most affected by marketing, like teenagers, for example, the way they get their information is by going on social media, not looking at billboards on the highway, which is Llamas 21 explains that only 7 people would consider taking a drug if they see it advertised, which is why there's no impact on this argument about advertisements either.
That was 145 used. Let me write it down. Okay, so the order is gonna be frontlining so I'll be basically responding to what you just heard from the previous rebuttal, and then I'll be going on to my opponent's arguments. I'll be starting at the top on the enforcement overview that we read. Okay. Anyone not ready? In this case, time starts. They say that Biden isn't actually passing any policies for enforcement, and it's not actually happening. There's 2 problems. First, they never respond to the Elkins evidence, which indicates that 55% of all Americans actually want decriminalization. And second, you can actually empirically see this happening. For example, the ICE is no longer prosecuting drug crimes, which empirically shows that this is happening. But at this point, go on to our first argument about price drops. They first say that it's fallen by 75%, but what they don't tell you is that it's fallen by 75% in the last 50 years, and still the prices of illicit drugs is still really high, so it doesn't matter. Then they tell you it's inelastic, but they never respond to our evidence, which indicates that prices are going to drop by 95% post-legalization. Even if it is inelastic, this is still going to increase demand drastically. Then they make this really important response that says that taxes is going to make the cost 2 to 3 times higher. This is really important. It's because this takes out their own argument, because their own argument is that people should turn to the legal market after legalization. But they also read in rebuttal that the legal market is going to be 2 to 3 times more expensive than an illegal market, which is empirically why in California, which is their own example, 90% of the market remains illegal. This short circuits all of the benefits that they talk about better option, about better rehab, and about safer sellers, because if people no longer turn to the legal market in the first place, which is what they tell you themselves, they're not going to be accessing their own benefits. Their own turn is contradicting with their case. This takes out majority of the offense in the round. But on to our second argument about Big Pharma. on lobbying, they give you two responses. First, they say the legal industry is going to take over. That's exactly our argument. We're saying that the legal industry, which is these big pharma, they're going to lobby and they're going to take over and they're going to flood the market. That's our argument. Second, they make this response that lobbying is failing because Biden isn't budging. Well, empirically, McGreal explains that 90% of the House and 97% of the senators actually do take bribes from these big pharma, so lobbying clearly is happening. But then on doctors overprescribing, their only response is that it's fallen by 44%. There's three problems. First, we tell you they can't just sue every single doctor. It's pretty improbable. Second, we say overprescription rates is still high insofar as 80% of addicts started from overprescription. And third, this 44% drop took over 20 years for them to reform the policy, which proves that this is going to take a long time. We can't risk this. But lastly, on advertisement, their first response is that you can't advertise. And second is that people look to social media. There's two problems. First, they never respond to the New York Times evidence, which explains that when you nationally legalize all drugs, this gives them First Amendment rights, which is what allows them to not be a felony and allows them to actually advertise nationally. But second, we tell you that sure, they're able to just advertise on social media. If you look to Juul ads and why so many people in the US started like vaping, it clearly proves our argument. But at this point, let's go to my opponent's argument. And their first argument, they talk about incarceration's three problems. First, their statistic is about arrest, not incarceration, where prison policy finds that the myth of ending drug arrest would stop incarceration because 80% of people are in jail for worse crimes than drug offenses, which is why they're not going to be able to solve for majority of their impact. But second, Spirit 19 explains that police officers target non-violent crimes to fill quotas, which they have to do to turn to other things if they don't turn to drug crimes. And thirdly, our argument actually takes this out because Howard explains that when you have higher usage, you get more things like driving under influence or using drugs near a school zone, which increases incarceration, which happens in our world. But on their second argument about safety, remember their own response that takes this out. But even in their best case scenario, you can actually, first, when they talk about like safer regulation, they just concede themselves that they're not going to be turning to these safer regulations because it's too expensive. But on shifting to alternatives, all of their evidence is specifically talking to marijuana. But when we legalize all drugs, they can also turn to things like fentanyl, which is comparatively worse. And lastly, on rehabilitation, they say that stigma goes down, but McGree finds that when stigma goes down, usage goes up because children and kids find that it's easier and socially acceptable to actually use drugs, which is why we're very proud to negate.
All right, ready for cross?
Sure.
Okay. Can I have the first question?
Of course.
All right, let's set the time now. So when a person actually starts using drugs, like how many like drug addicts end up dying?
They're 13 times more likely to die than their peers.
Okay, well, what does that mean though? Because you have 100% probability of dying. So like my question is how, like 13 times a normal person, what is the baseline probability for that normal person who is not addicted to drugs?
I'm not sure. I'm sure you can tell me.
Okay, well, it's probably pretty low because they're probably like a person who's not addicted to drugs probably won't die from a drug overdose. So if it's like a 0.01% and you have like a 13 times increase, that's still like 0.013. So
I mean, like, it's pretty pointless to argue about this since your own argument also tries to say that you're going to decrease like drug usage, right? So we have this.
Our argument is that our argument is that you make it safer like for people who are on the brink of overdose. But you can have a question.
Sure. Okay. Let's talk about your second link or your second mechanism about like shifting to cannabis, right? So where does your evidence, like which state is it sampling?
The AAC evidence is talking about California, and there was a 25% decrease in overdose.
Exactly. So did California legalize all illicit drugs or only cannabis?
No, it was only cannabis.
Right. Okay. So how is this representative when we legalize all illicit drugs and things such as like more dangerous drugs like fentanyl?
Yeah, so you ignore the Raymond evidence that we also read that says that 80% of people shift to marijuana specifically, and the reason
why everything else is illegal.
Wait, let me finish. The reason, no, this is out of all drugs. It says that specifically it's marijuana. Wait, let me finish.
Other things are illegal, which is why they can't.
No. The evidence specifically isolates out of all drugs.
It does not. I've read this study. It's only specific to states that have legalized marijuana and haven't legalized marijuana. It's not states that legalize marijuana and legalize all illicit drugs.
Nothing. Let me finish. The reason why people would rather go to marijuana than fentanyl, for example, is like you yourself tell me, fentanyl is very dangerous, which is why if there were two alternatives, they would would go with the safer one because they don't want to die. Now, can I have a question?
That's not what your evidence says. You're over.
Right, that's an analytic. Like, I think it
That's not
logically
what
makes sense that people don't want to die, and as a result, they shift to the safer option as compared to the more dangerous option. It just logically makes sense. Now, can I have a question?
Not necessarily, but sure.
Okay, let's talk about your argument on yeah, so let's talk about your argument about ads. So you say that there's like the First Amendment that protects like marketing, right? So if that were true, then why are drug advertisements illegal even right now? Like, doesn't the First Amendment also exist right now?
Because the drugs are illicit, so you can't
Right, no, but it's still,
because it's
well,
nationally banned.
no, well, that also doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because even though drugs are illegal, that doesn't mean that the First Amendment still exists. So I can still say whatever I want, but it's still a felony, right?
You can't.
And also, like, why does the First Amendment just apply to everything? There's a lot of things it doesn't protect. Like, for example, like,
Yes, for example, it applies all like the alcohol ads. It applies to all like the drool ads and all the vaping ads, etc. The reason why it doesn't apply.
The reason why is
because fentanyl is illegal.
Art Davis evidence is very explicit that says that specifically things like alcohol are legal, but illicit drugs like marijuana won't be. We'll take prep.
That was our prep. So I'm gonna go start on the weighing where I just weigh the impacts of both sides. And then I'm gonna go on to our case and then on their case. If everyone can hear me okay. Great, I'm just gonna grab a drink of water first. All right, time will begin on my first word. Start on the weighing. Firstly, weighing are prerequisite. Their arguments are about increasing usage, but insofar as we make drugs safer by providing treatment, then it short circuits their argument. Even if more people use drugs, on net, less people are hurt because more people can access treatment. But secondly, weighing probability, their evidence is super speculative, whereas we give empirics about when you decriminalize or legalize drugs, you get safer treatment, safer access. But third, weigh on scope. Their argument is that you increase drug use, but you don't know how many people you impact, whereas we impact up to everyone that uses drugs right now by providing treatment to everyone that is on drugs right now. At this point, you can go on to our case. They say a couple of things. They make one response on specifically on our arguments. They say that heavy taxes are too expensive, which takes out our arguments. But the problem with that is it doesn't take out our third warrant about rehabilitation. We tell you that when you make drugs, that rehabilitation will become more accessible, which is really important. They say, but this is really important. At this point, you can extend our argument. We tell you that SWIC tells you that stigma prevents treatment, which is why the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services tells you that only 2.2 million people received treatment in 2015, despite the number of people with substance use disorders being 20.8 million. Legalization destigmatizes drugs, and WIRE tells you people can get treatment without stigma. The New York Times tells you that empirically the number of people in Portugal receiving treatment rose after decriminalization. The impact is saving lives. CDC tells you that nearly 841,000 people have died since 1999 from a drug overdose. They make the response saying that stigma resulted in an increase in usage. But number one, they can see the uniqueness. We tell you that tens of millions of people are already using drugs right now, which means you can't increase it anymore because it's already so high. But secondly, they can see that stigma decreases under our world. This is really important because that means that people can finally access treatment. Thirdly, just because stigma decreases doesn't mean people will actually use drugs, right? People understand that drugs are really dangerous. Just because stigma goes away doesn't mean that people feel inclined to try fentanyl, because everyone knows that fentanyl is really bad for you. The reason why people don't do drugs is because they understand the impact they have on their lives, which is why they don't do drugs. It's not because of stigma, but people can't access treatment because of stigma, which we solve for. At this point, you can go on to their case. We say a couple of things. On their first argument, we tell you that number one, heavy taxation results in increase in prices. So 90% of black market in California is illegal. They say that it takes out our own argument that legal market is really expensive, but that's not responsive. That's like, this is conceded. They concede that heavy taxation results in an increase in prices, which means it takes out their first argument about drugs becoming cheaper. This is really important. But secondly, it also doesn't take out our argument because that's not the argument we're going for. Then on their second argument, Big Pharma, we say a couple of things. Number one, we say that Big Pharma lobbying doesn't matter because the Democrats aren't budging. They say that senators do take bribes, but the problem with this is that you should prefer our evidence insofar as our evidence tells you that Biden isn't budging, and Biden is the one with the power to veto bills, which is why overall you should prefer our evidence. But secondly, we say that federal losses prevent overprescription, which is why empirically overprescription has decreased by 44% in recent years. They say that you can't sue every doctor, but that's not responsive insofar as it's just the threat of a lawsuit is enough to prevent it. But secondly, they don't individually sue doctors, these like sue like hospitals and stuff. But then we also tell you that on ads, like marketing will always be a felony of these drugs. They say that that's that when you like legalize drugs, it gives First Amendment rights. But no, there's no warrant for that. But secondly, First Amendment rights doesn't always apply. For example, for defamation. But secondly, our evidence is very explicit. It's talking about like these first like high class drugs specifically. At this point, you can cleanly affirm.
I'm going to begin by talking about the negatives arguments. Then I'll talk about some of the like comparative stuff that Rena does at the top of her speech. And then I'll talk about their argument about treatment and stigma. Okay, is anyone not ready? All right. I'm going to start with overprescription. They say on our argument about overprescription that eventually it went down and the threat of a lawsuit is enough to scare doctors away. But what they did not respond to, which is what Johnson told you, which is that it took 20 years after the opioid crisis began for the government to even begin to crack down on the overprescription that's happening because these pharmaceutical lobbyers are so entrenched in drug regulation agencies like the FDA and like the DEA. That's why you can extend this argument. Big Pharma is giving kickbacks and bribes doctors to overprescribe substances to get patients hooked, and they can do this because they have so much control over drug regulators. Legalization now means dangerous new substances can be pushed directly to patients. That's why empirically, after receiving a benefit, a doctor increases prescriptions to patients by 60%, and in fact, 80% of drug addicts began by abusing prescription. You can also talk about ads. What Rena tells you is that there is no reason why the First Amendment applies in this scenario. Yes, we've explained to you very specifically the reason why it's a felony to advertise right now is because drugs are illegal federally, but when you federally legalize it, they're protected by the US Constitution and the First Amendment, which enables free speech. That's why you see alcohol ads everywhere. That's why you see Juul ads everywhere. That's why legalization means pharmaceutical producers can freely market these deadly drugs because they're protected by free speech. Unfortunately, though, 2/3 of Americans take action after seeing a drug ad, and 80% remember the benefits, but only 20% remember side effects. That's why overall hard drug use can triple in an affirmative world, equating to 4.5 million more cases of hard drug dependency, costing trillions of dollars and millions of lives. Let's do with the weighing. What Rena tells you is that, oh, we can make drugs safer through treatment and more people can access treatment. No, the reason why people need rehabilitation in the first place is because they're addicted. Even if they try to fix addiction, insofar as they're causing so much more, they're just putting a bandage on the problem that they caused in the first place. But even then, I would argue they're not able to help these people because if usage goes up by so much, insofar as it literally triples, this overwhelms the healthcare system so much that none of these people are actually able to afford proper care, and they're probably going to have super long waiting times in order to get this care that they talk about. Even then, even if they stop the current drug crisis, though, we're still going to create another alcohol, tobacco, and opioid epidemic that's going to affect so many more people. So even if they solve the current crisis, which is like 100,000 deaths per year, we're literally going to cause 3 times that many deaths in an affirmative world, another problem that they have to solve. They say they're more probable because they have the example of Portugal, but our examples are specific to the US. You have the alcohol epidemic in the US. You have the tobacco epidemic. You have the opioid epidemic that literally just happened a couple years ago and is still happening to this day. Our examples are clearly better. Let's talk about the stigma argument. Specifically, though, they still lose here. They say that millions of people are using drugs right now, but at the same time, people understand drugs are dangerous. I think that's a contradiction. If it's so dangerous, why are so many people addicted right now? Even then, insofar as some people are never going to accept taking help from the government because there's always going to be some sort of stigma against drugs, but when you legalize drugs, you still encourage so much more usage, which is seen by drugs like Juuls. That means so many more people are going to be using drugs in an affirmative world. So even if some people are getting care, overall, there's always going to be a group of people that never end up getting care and are going to be extremely under threat.
Ready for cross?
Yeah,
Can we have the first question since we spoke first?
of course.
Okay, I'll start timing my first word. So, Johnson, tell me, do you do fentanyl?
Nope,
And why is that?
because it's bad.
Yeah, you understand that it's bad. Even if you saw an ad saying that we should try fentanyl, you would never do it because you
Okay.
understand that
Wait,
fentanyl is
that-
super bad and it would like mess up your life.
Rena, that's
mean,
not how
actually-
pharmaceutical advertising works. Number one,
Also,
they can
also if
heavily-
that's true, there wouldn't be any drug addicts in the whole world because everybody knows that drugs is bad.
No.
So clearly that
No,
line
no. So the reason why people do drugs right now is because they have like other issues that cause them to do drugs. They don't do it because there's no stigma around drugs.
Yeah. So for example, right? Like for example, like you yourself admit the reason you don't do drugs is because it's dangerous. But for the people who are using drugs right now, they're doing drugs not because they think it's safe. The reason why is because there are other issues in their life that compel them to use drugs.
I think this is a very multifaceted issue. This is a very multifaceted issue that I don't think you can cover in like a 3-minute crossfire. Insofar as with the opioid epidemic, a lot of people went to their doctors thinking these substances were safe because these companies just rebrand these substances. They just give it a new name. Like, of course, they're not going to call it cocaine. They'll call it like Plocaine or something, or like something nicer. Like, that's not how ads work.
Andrew,
right?
that doesn't make any sense, right?
Like,
no one's going to advertise cocaine and say, let's get Plocaine. Like, that's not what happens.
Okay,
if you
Rena. Like, they advertise
legalization with weed, they don't rebrand. It's still weed. It's still marijuana. They still phrase it. They still advertise it as marijuana, even if when there is advertisements.
Rena, you asked the question. Let me respond really quickly. So, for example, they'll do things like Juuls, where they advertise nicotine as like mango flavored, for example, which is obviously they're not going to be like, come get some nicotine. They're going to be like, oh, look at this great product. But also
the difference is though, like the advertisements that you hear about like lower, like kind of like less effective drugs like alcohol or nicotine.
Okay.
What our evidence says specifically is that they would make it a felony to advertise drugs like fentanyl, like these like worse drugs, right?
One,
it's been 2 minutes. I'm going to take a question. Okay, I'm going to take a question. It's been 2 minutes. So all of your empirics on rehab comes from Portugal. Did Portugal legalize all illicit drugs? Yes or no?
It decriminalize all illicit.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the difference between the two?
So I say that they're pretty similar in the sense that you still like
difference is that they don't create.
Our evidence is actually really good on this. Our evidence,
it's not.
Our evidence from Weir says that both legalization and decriminalization work. And if you had made this response, some other speech other than Grand Crossfire would respond.
You guys are also trying to respond to our argument in Grand Crossfire with a brand new thing. Like, let's just like engage in the logic here, okay?
The reason why
decriminalization took 2 years to decriminalize, which means they had time to expand healthcare, which doesn't happen when you legalize under the motion. But also,
this is a really new response that has nothing to do with any of the responses that you read earlier in any of your speeches. Like,
and also Rita did do something about how there are old causes to like.
I'm just trying to ask a question about your argument. Also, like, Johnson, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so the difference between decriminalization and legalization is that with decriminalization, you're not legalizing the product, which is why you don't have things like increased prescription, increased advertising.
That doesn't take out our pass. We don't have any more prep, so it's just going to go. It's going to start on the weighing, and then it's going to go to our argument about rehab, and then their arguments on their case. Is that good with everyone? Let's start the time now. The only weighing that Andrew does is that drug use causes an increase in rehabilitation, but he misses what Rena says. We say that even if there's an increase in drug use doesn't inherently matter if on net people are getting access to medication and life-saving medication. That means that on net less people are dying, which means that drug use doesn't inherently matter if less people are dying. But the second piece of weighing that they also miss is a scope weighing. We say they have no idea how many people are going to have more drugs in their world, in our world. However, you know that when there's increased rehab, that affects every single person who's using drugs right now. So that means that our arguments just affect a lot more people, which is why it's simply the most important impact in the round. Let's go to our argument now. So Andrew extends a couple of responses in summary. The first thing that he says is that usage goes up because of destigmatization, but he misses Rena's response. Number one, we tell you that drug use is already very high right now. It's very improbable for it to go up any higher. But secondly, most importantly, is that they've conceded that the reason why people don't use drugs right now is not because it's stigmatized, it's because they don't want to mess up their life. That's really important because that means that there's no on-net increase in drug use after destigmatization. Their second response is that it overwhelms the healthcare system. This is new in second summary and doesn't interact with the argument. We say that the US has a pretty advanced healthcare system that can handle a lot of these people who would need rehab in our world. The last thing they say is that there's some stigma that would still exist, but we say that on net you take out a lot of the stigma that exists with people who use drugs right now, which is why on net they're going to go to the doctor more. This argument is important because the weird evidence tells you that when you destigmatize drugs, when you decriminalize drugs, that results in an increase in destigmatization, which results in an increase in rehabilitation. The Frocht evidence tells you that it's only 10% of people who use rehab in the US, but it's 75% in Portugal. It's the CDC evidence that's really important. Just that 841,000 people are dying every single since 1999, which is the biggest impact. Let's go to their case. On the argument about overprescription, extend the response that the government is cracking down on fraud charges, which by the AMA told you that overprescription has fallen by 44%. They say it takes a long time, but insofar as it's already happening right now, we're going to also fall back for their issue. On the argument about ads, remember that Section 843 of the Controlled Substances Act makes marketing a crime, which means that on net, the First Amendment isn't going to be able to protect them.
Okay, so the order is going to be starting on our argument about doctors overprescription and then going on to ads and then weighing the debate. Anyone not ready?
Johnson, check the doc very quickly.
It's okay. Anyone not ready? In this case, let's go to our argument about doctors overprescription. This is a very easy place for you to negate. Their only response is that there's some doctors that are being cracked down upon in the status quo. There's two problems. First, they never respond to our argument that this took really long time, which means that if we're able to increase, which means that if drug use goes up, this is not going to happen. But second, we tell you that doctors overprescription is still happening in the status quo and is still killing a lot of people. But at this point, the argument's really simple. It's that right now, pharma companies are giving kickbacks and bribes to doctors to get them to overprescribe substances, which is why the request evidence indicates that after bribes are given, prescription goes up by 60%, and the NIDA quantifies that 80% of all current users are because of doctors' overprescription, which is going to happen again when you affirm and legalize all drugs. But the second place where it's very easy for you to vote is on our argument about advertisement. Their only response is that it's going to be illegal, but the New York Times evidence finds that the only reason why it's illegal is because it's federally illegal right now, which is why they can't advertise these drugs. But when you affirm, you make all of these illicit drugs legal, which is why you see things like alcohol, like Juul ads, because they're federally legal. This is really important because the law must evidence finds that when people see ads, usage goes up by 43%, and because people remember 80% of the benefits of the drugs and the ads that they see, where they only remember 20% of the downside because the ads are really misleading. All of this is really bad because Colkins finds that usage is going to triple, leading to a 4.5 million more cases in a world where drugs are legal. At this point, there's two pieces of weighing which they never respond to. The first is the root cause analysis made by Andrew, which is that even if you're able to get rehab, the reason why you need rehab in the first place is because there's drug use, which is why if you're able to stop drug use in the status quo, you no longer need rehab, which is why you always look to our arguments first. But the second is the short circuit, is that if you're going to see a tripling of usage, which is 4.5 million more cases, this overwhelms all of the rehab and all of the medical resources that they're talking about on their side, which is why you're always going to be looking to usage. You'll always be looking to the negative.
Good round.
Good round, guys.
Debate. And
Good
thank
round.
you guys for watching.
Okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for a really good debate. Yeah, really appreciate you turning around after the turkey debates and doing the drug debate. So, but yeah, thanks for an excellent round. So this was a 2-1 decision for the con. So congratulations. Yeah, thank you everyone for the debate today. And yeah, thank you, Aman, for joining us as well.
Nice to meet you, Aman.
Nice to meet you guys. And yeah, very good debate overall. I think it's, I've not seen such intensity being spoken over 4 minutes in recent very, very good, you guys. Yeah.
Thank you for judging, and thanks for the round, guys.
Good round, and thanks all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone. Talk to all y'all soon.